All right, so here's a tour of the Cummins R2.8 engine in the Delica L300. So right now, I have both the hood plate and the seat plate off because they're being insulated, so it's a good time to make this video. So starting at the front, got this big aluminum radiator. This is from a V8 Dodge Ram in the 70s, fit almost perfectly in the space. This radiator is proper 2-core, 3.5 inches thick. Then we have a 3800 CFM electric fan kit bolted to that radiator. That CFM closely matches what is calculated for the stock fan. The upper radiator hose is just some off-the-shelf silicone pre-bends made for a nice smooth routing, vibration isolation, and this coupler here has temperature sensors for our aftermarket temperature gauge and the original dash cluster along with the grounding lug. The original pressure cap was disabled. This car has a fully pressurized coolant system, unlike the original. This is kind of similar to Volkswagen's. So you'll see that this is kind of the upper bleeder hose, another bleeder hose. The highest bleeder point on the engine here is the liquid cooled EGR. So all these bleeders kind of come together and then kind of line comes off to go into our expansion tank. So this is just pure air volume for the coolant system to use to expand. Following that around, that also dumps into the main coolant tank. That's where coolant is filled, and that's where the gauge is on the side to measure coolant level as well. You'll also see up front here we have this nice stainless steel braided line. This is actually for the front heater core. This was relocated from the side where it originally was over the top to provide room for the front mount intercooler piping. This was also nice because it basically took 6 feet of heater hose out of the system, so the front heater core works a little better compared to what it used to. On the right hand side, this is the oil catch can. This is the main PCV breather, so it breathes into that catch can, goes around into the intake. Also on this side, you'll see these are the AC lines. This car has a low mount compressor on the right hand side, so custom AC lines were made. Those run up front to the original condenser and the original evaporator junction. You'll see also the brake booster line for vacuum. This just runs over across the front to the included vacuum pump on this engine. So pretty nice to just have a hose run around and everything works as it should. You'll notice the alternator's high mount. Also on the right side, which was nice because we were able to reuse the original alternator wiring with no modification. Just bolt that sucker on there and go. Provides charging. Underneath this alternator is the power steering pump. That was also plumbed into the original power steering reservoir, and some new custom lines were made from the pump to go to the original steering rack. The air intake follows the exact same routing as the stock 4D56, up and around into the original air filter. The only main difference besides the tubing itself is there's a mass airflow sensor here that communicates with the ECU. Moving on to the other side of the car, you'll notice this little widget here. This is a custom machine throttle linkage, fully adjustable. So this is the original throttle cable, and so this pulls our transmission kickdown cable. So when you push the gas pedal, not only are you actuating the electronic sensor for the ECU, but you're also pulling this linkage, communicating to the transmission it's time to downshift. Also on the left is the grid heater high current relay. Instead of glow plugs, this car has a grid heater in the intake manifold. This was located on the left side to keep the wiring nice and short. It also provided a nice conduit to run the main wires that go to the ECU and all the other ones that we've added for sensors and whatnot. So we've got wires coming from the ECU forward into the cabin, and then also from the engine back to the ECU, all nicely dressed along the side. That wiring continues up into the original harness, which goes over the engine bay and back down, nice and out of the way. The starter on this car is actually now on the right hand side, so there's also a nice heavy gauge starter wire running over the top and down. Continuing on with some of the electronics, the original coolant bottle was replaced with a fuse box. This has fuses and relays for the electric fans, fog lights, high beams, some of the higher current loads in this car. Also new batteries. These are Daka Intimidator AGMs, probably my favorite brand out there. Have them in all my cars. They last forever. and you can deep cycle the crap out of them and recharge them back to life. So these are about 700 cold cranking amps each, so plenty of juice there. Continuing to move backward, we have the EGR inlet. So this is where the Cummins EGR meets the intake manifold. Behind that there's a custom oil line that comes up here. Then this has our aftermarket oil pressure gauge and the original 4D56 oil pressure switch. The oil pressure gauge is important because the 4D56 switch only activates at around 9 psi, and the switch in the Cummins only throws a check engine light around 5 psi. So pretty low, lower than I'd like, so I decided to add an oil pressure gauge to make sure that I know what the oil pressure is, keep an eye on that pressure, and make sure the engine always has lubrication. Basically an added safety layer. And then I guess the final thing is the intercooler piping. Originally this car had an air to water intercooler around the back of the motor, but that couldn't keep up with the steep highway climbs. So the charge piping kind of comes out from the turbo under the fender, goes to the new bar and plate front mount intercooler, comes around and back into the intake manifold. Another aspect of this install is that this engine is in about the same location as the original. So the center of mass is about right. There's a little more weight up front just because the engine's heavier, plus all the subsystems, so that had to be accommodated for. All the bracketing and mounting was all drilled and riv nutted. No welding onto the chassis to prevent rust. Even the engine mounts down below here on the subframe all bolt onto existing locations. No drilling or anything was needed for that. It is a tight squeeze, so there was a couple areas down here and on this side that needed to be hammered out and bumped out, but again, almost no cutting, almost no drilling besides riv nuts. Just a lot of finagling to get everything to fit, and it is a tight squeeze, and it is pretty terrible to work on, but it's in there, it fits, and this motor has been great so far, but got about almost 1,000 miles on it at this point. But yeah, there's the tour of the R2.8 engine bay.